Hello, everyone. Welcome to this next session by Dr. Susan Sheehan from the University of Huddersfield on thinking about classroom assessment. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Okay. I'm delighted to be speaking today at New Directions, although it would be nice if I were over there rather than over here. And today I'm going to be talking about classroom assessment and a project which I undertook to explore what teachers think about classroom assessment. First of all, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the support of the British Council, which funded this project through the ELTRA scheme. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to discuss the background for the project and how it grew out of a language assessment literacy project and how we felt we needed another framework through which to understand classroom assessment and how teachers think about classroom assessment. I'll present a literature review, which will cover some aspects of language assessment literacy, some aspects of teacher cognition, and some research which has looked at the role of teachers and how sometimes they can feel divided between their role as a language facilitator and the role as a language assessor. I will describe the methodology of the project, focusing on the classroom observations and interviews. There were other parts of the project which included questionnaire and follow-up project, but I won't cover follow-up interviews, but I won't be able to cover those today. I'll present the results and some conclusions and implications for practice, particularly teacher training practice. So the overall framework which underpins this work is Borg's framework of language teacher cognition. Now, language teacher cognition may not be a familiar term to people who are more involved in assessment research. So I've provided a definition, and this definition focuses on some key features. One is that it's for language teachers specifically. So it's not a general education model. It's one which Borg has developed thinking about language teachers. So it's language teacher specific. It highlights the role of working conditions. And in our case, that could be curriculum pressures, the examination system, pressures to complete a curriculum within a certain teaching time. And we have this idea of knowledge, thoughts, and beliefs. So knowledge is what we know about teaching, which was developed through teacher training. Beliefs are more deep-seated, more internalized, and these beliefs can often develop before we've even started teacher training. Because before we become teachers, we all spend many, many years in classrooms as students. And the foundations of some of these beliefs may come from our time when we were ourselves in the classroom. And thoughts are what we are thinking as we go into the classroom, the minute by minute decisions which we make while we are teaching. So this project developed out of a project which I conducted with Sonia Munro and Vivian Berry, which is written up in the ELT journal. And it was looking at language assessment literacy. And we went into the classroom, we observed teachers, we interviewed teachers. And when we were observing, we saw that the teachers were using a wide variety of assessment practices very successfully. But when we interviewed the teachers, they told us, no, that wasn't assessment, that was teaching. And assessment was conflated with testing, which was considered to have a negative influence on the classroom, whereas teaching was considered to support learning, and this was positive. So we realized as we conducted that project, we were actually thinking about assessment in a completely different way from the teachers which we had spoken to. So this led us to a desire to find a way to understand teacher thinking better. And this is why we turned to Borg's framework of language teacher cognition, so we could understand how teachers thought about assessment better. There are three main sections to Borg's framework: schooling, professional coursework, and classroom practice. So by schooling, we mean our experiences when we were ourselves school children, school pupils. So for example, when I learnt French at high school, our French teacher would make us do a vocabulary test every Friday. And if we scored below 80% on this test, we would have to stand up and take the test in front of the whole group again on Monday morning. Now, to the best of my knowledge, only one person was ever made to take the test again. That's all I can remember. So you could argue that it worked. You know, I crammed, I got the required grade, but then once I'd passed the test, I didn't retain that knowledge. I was just getting ready for the next one. So it didn't inspire me to love French, which is a pity, because now I find myself in a situation where I learned French for 7 years, and now basically all I have is tourism. You know, I can go to France, I can order a meal, I can check into a hotel, but I don't really know French very well. Professional coursework is teacher training. That can be initial teacher training, ongoing continuous professional development sessions, attending conferences like this. And classroom practice is the day-to-day life in the classroom, but also highlighting contextual factors, because a lot of decisions around assessment aren't in the hands of the teachers. They are using assessments which are required of them by the overall education system or the management of the institution in which they work. So looking at LAL, language assessment literature, there's an element of expecting people to test as they were tested, in a similar way to people teach as they were taught. So there's an idea that perhaps teachers are using the assessment practices they experience themselves in their schooling. There's also a range of studies in language assessment literacy which suggests that teachers do not have a good understanding of assessment, or they lack assessment knowledge. And looking more at teacher cognition research, there's the idea that what happens in teacher training influences less than our experiences at school. So we spend hours and hours in school. Lorty calls this the apprenticeship of observation. So how we think a classroom should be is conditioned by our experiences as school pupils ourselves. And there's another body of research which is looking at this conflict between the teacher being the facilitator and the teacher being assessor, and feeling much more comfortable in the facilitator role and feeling unhappy about being in the language assessor role. So these were the three research questions, and they closely follow Borg's framework. So it's looking at schooling experiences, looking at teacher education experiences, and then looking at how these form our beliefs as teachers and how then these beliefs are put into practice. So today I'm talking about the classroom observations, and we conducted structured observations. So we had a sheet with 15 different assessment activities on the sheet. We would observe the lesson. Every time we observed one of the assessment activities, we would put a tick on our sheet and make some notes. Every 3 minutes, we would start a fresh observation sheet. So the observations, which lasted for 60 minutes, generated 20 observation sheets. We had used this protocol in our previous project, so we were confident that it captured a whole range of assessment practices, And it was based on work by Colby, Kelly and Turner in 2007, who created an observation schedule looking at assessment for learning practices. So we had our observations, but we also wanted to know what the teachers were thinking. So then we interviewed the teachers and would ask them about what was happening at particular stages in their teaching sessions. So the observations were conducted at an English language centre associated with a UK university. The follow-up interviews were around 45 minutes. The teachers had all worked within and without the UK. They were very well qualified. 3 of them were educated to MA level. There were 3 female teachers, 1 male, which reflects the overall balance of teaching. There tends to be more females than males. The age range was 32 to 60 plus. I don't know exactly how old the person who is 60 plus is, because I didn't feel it was polite to ask, but she'd already retired from one job before coming to work at this English language centre. So she definitely had more than 40 years of teaching experience. I'm mainly going to present the interview data today, but I will talk about particular activities which were happening in the classroom to provide some context for the interviews. So these are quotes which relate to their experiences as school children. And to provide a bit of context, GCSE and A-level are public examinations which are taken in England and Wales at 16 and 18, and they influence what kind of jobs people can apply for and if they are going to go on to university. So they're very key exams in England and Wales. And there seems to be a general feeling in these quotes that assessment is negative, that assessment is just generating numbers, they're being assessed for the sake of it. And there seems to be this clear separation between learning and assessing. And I think that echoes results which I found in the previous project, that assessing and teaching are considered to be different. In the data as a whole, there's a lot more discussion of schooling experiences, and in the questionnaires and interviews, this was a very big theme with people talking about how they felt the assessment process was shady, they didn't understand the reason behind the marks they got, they didn't understand what they had to do to study better. So that came out more in the questionnaire data, but in this project, it was mainly around assessment being something which was done more for bureaucratic purposes. It was to generate a score, just to assess because assessment is what you have to do, rather than assessment for facilitating learning. I'm now going to move on to professional coursework. And when I was observing the teacher, he was conducting a lengthy peer feedback activity. And in the case of the 60-minute lesson, this was about 20 minutes of teaching activity. So it was a substantial part of the lesson. So I was talking to him about why he was using peer feedback, what was the reasons behind that choice of activity in that lesson. And he talked a lot about sort of the power relations, negotiations, clarifications, and about it supporting a student-centered approach to learning. But I've put this quote in professional coursework because I think we can see how this person has really embedded knowledge from his teacher training experiences and put them into practice in the classroom. So we can see, allusions to Krashen and Schmidt and noticing. So these are theories of teaching and learning which are often discussed in initial teacher training. So we can see that these ideas have really become central to this person's teaching practice and their belief in putting the students at the center of his teaching practice. There's a little caveat here that this person might have been responding to me because of my role within the university, and he might have been feeling that he should talk about these issues because he knew that that is the kind of thing I would be talking about when I was being a teacher rather than being a researcher. Now there's some quotes about professional coursework and assessment. And I think the first quote is interesting because there's an emphasis on being correct. So she wants to do the correct thing. So she feels that assessment is something which comes from outside of her and that she has to, do what is correct, do what is expected of her. And the other thing which I think is interesting in this quote is that she talks about changing with whatever style we have to do. So there's this idea that, practice is transient, that she has to do what she's told to do, what she is told to do will keep on changing, and she has to keep on responding to those changes, but she doesn't have much input or opportunity to make decisions around those trainings, around those assessment decisions. So she's talking about summative, formative. So she's saying she has searched for training, but she feels that assessment is essentially something which comes from outside her decision-making process. And this relates to work which is done by Coursework and colleagues in 2016. And they found that the teachers with the heaviest workloads had the strongest negative feelings towards assessment. I think, and that's understandable, that if we have very heavy teaching workloads, assessment becomes something which is an extra burden, something which we have to do on top of our teaching practice. And the second quote is talking about how assessment isn't really covered in a lot of approaches to language teacher training. So this person mentions her experiences from CELTA and says that assessment wasn't really covered on the course, and that echoes comments made in our first project into language assessment literacy, which spoke about teachers feeling as though they hadn't really had any sort of direct training about assessment because CELTA and such courses focused on what was happening in the classroom, and they felt that was right. They appreciated that. They wanted direct teaching training rather than assessment training. And moving on to classroom practice, there seems to be this conflict between assessment, which stresses the students, which doesn't give the students the best opportunity to show themselves, what they can do, how their language proficiency has progressed over the period of learning, and what they want to do as student-centered teachers. And they're contrasting their classroom practices, where they're talking about helping all students to feel as though they are making progress and trying to reward and motivate students, with the kind of the systemic, the bureaucratic demands of assessment, which seem to be punishing students, pressurizing students, making students feel stressful. So, and again, there is this conflict between assessments which are not created by the teacher, but by external forces. And this brings out this element of conflict between what they want to work, how they want to work with their students in the classroom, but at the same time knowing that these students are going to face these external assessments, wanting to prepare the students for the external assessments, but also worrying about those students who are perhaps not going to score very highly on those assessments, and perhaps feeling that the assessments aren't recognizing all the achievements and all the progress which the learners are making. And again, this is about how the pressure of teaching and how this is a burden for the teachers. So the results, experience was generally negative, but there is some evidence to suggest that training shapes classroom practices. And there's a strong evidence that all the teachers are helping learners gain a sense of achievement in their language learning, but this doesn't necessarily match with the assessment practices of the organizations they work for. So we found that the teachers didn't replicate assessment practices in contrast with the language assessment literacy. They were very confident in assessment practices, and there's no evidence that they didn't have assessment knowledge. And we found that teachers did feel conflict in their role as language facilitators and assessors, with obviously privileging their role as facilitators. In terms of practice, I would recommend that teacher training courses focus more on classroom assessment activities, and when trainee teachers are in teaching practice, they receive more feedback on their assessment practices as part of their teaching practice sessions. Okay, thank you for joining me today. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to respond to them.
Thank you, Susan. That's a very informative lesson, I must say. I think we lost Jen for a minute, but I don't see any question yet, but I do see a very good observation that I think is nice to hear, just to share with you from the chat box. Meena Patel suggests that the areas of teacher identity and teacher belief are so important and used to be underestimated and under-acknowledged. I'm happy to see that they are quite now regularly in discussion at conferences like this, and thanks, Susan.
Okay, thank you, Meena. Good, thank you for your comment.
Meena actually also have a follow-up question, if you don't mind me to have it too. Could you say a little bit more about the conflicts teacher talk about between beginner facilitators and assessor? Between facilitator and assessor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think facilitator is more around assessment for learning and sharing criteria and working with the students to perceive their progress. So in every activity, the learners understand that they are benefiting from the activities, that they are making progress, and they feel supported in the progress they are making. Whereas assessor is more the reporting function of assessment. So providing, scores, marks. In the case of the teachers in this study, it was around, would those students be ready to then go on and study for a full-time degree? So they felt they had the responsibility of passing or failing, and if they passed, were those students ready for full-time degree? And if they failed, what would that mean in terms of their long-term ambitions, their desires to study for a degree in the UK?
That is very true. Yeah, I must say there's a lot of things what you just say reflects on my observation as well. I'm personally based in Picasso in Vietnam, and a lot of your findings at home. So the comments and the talk that I hear from teachers, but it's lovely to see that you summarize it and organizing it here today, so everyone can have a very good overview. Quỳnh, actually, I'm talking about Vietnam. I can see audience from Vietnam. I have a questions about what is the difference between formative assessment and assessment for learning?
I would say they are part and parcel of the same process. So it's the idea of giving feedback, helping learners to understand what they need to do, talking about learning strategies, very much related to feed forward. So thinking, okay, this is where I am now. What do I need to do to move forward? How, as a teacher, can I help the students identify strategies for themselves? So I think assessment for learning formative, it's all around this idea that it is assessment which is helping and informing the learners as they make progress. And I think, you know, those terms have the same goal of promoting this kind of student-centered approach to teaching and assessing, where it's the teachers helping the learners to understand the progress which they are making. So I would consider them very closely related.
Right. But not the synonym, probably. But I'm with
Not
you.
exactly a synonym, but closely, very close.
Yes. Oh, I would love to hear. I hope there's a lot more Vietnamese teacher in the audience, because I think that's the message we want to talk to a lot our teacher community in my country too. Okay, one last question. Don't go yet, because we would love to spend more time with you. Cooper, if I apology for my pronunciation. So Cooper have the questions, which is, what is the most frequent classroom-based assessment you observe in this particular study?
It was self-assessment and peer assessment. So facilitating self and peer assessment was the most commonly used assessment.
Which also, actually, yeah, have a lot of advantages. That explains why.
Particularly peer assessment, that was I think that was probably the number one. And then there's a lot of discussion around self-assessment, sometimes as preparation for peer assessment and sometimes as a separate assessment activity, but mainly peer feedback, peer assessment was the most common one across the 4 lessons that we observed.
Right, thanks, Susan. Wow, another one. Wow, I'm very happy. Maybe I just say Vietnamese too much, and that's why we have more Vietnamese questions coming from. The amount of classroom-based assessment depends on the policy of the institution. What do you think teacher can do to promote class-based assessment?
It's a good point, and it's one which was clearly in the data, this kind of conflict between the expectations and the institutional assessment practices and what the teachers might want to do themselves. I think in terms of what I observed, the teachers would kind of make these assessments which they had to use as student-centered as possible. So for example, in the previous project, I saw the teacher going through some assessments, some tests which the students had already completed. But instead of just saying, you know, the answer to number 3 is B, she took it through them as a grammar auction. So the students could see sentences which they or their colleagues had written. They could look at them and decide whether they're going to buy the correct ones, whether they're going to buy the incorrect ones. And, you know, that was much more helping the learners to understand the reasons behind their errors or mistakes, rather than doing lots of practice tests and then lots of going over the test in the terms of, you know, B was the correct answer. So I think it's about trying to make even the assessments which aren't in the control of the teachers as learner-centered as possible.
Right, I see. I think the keyword is learner-centered, is student-centered, and what the value we can try to extract from the assessment. It's not just the number result, you know, a few level assessment, but yeah, it's about how to help them to understand what they need to do to better themselves. Well, Susan, I do think that this is really, really helpful. Speaking from my own experience and can see wide range of questions here. I do hope we have more chance to see you again. But for today, that's bring us to the end because we don't have more time. We thank you for your presentation. Allow me to also thank our audience for their participations. I know, I know I'm about to say goodbye, but when that seemed to really want to try to get a hold of you with the last questions, suggest some students do not trust peer assessment. What do you think? Maybe just another quick answer.
It's training. You can't walk in on Monday and say, hello, peer assessment. It's a process. And as they grow, the confidence grows. So it is a, self-assessment, peer assessment, they all do require the students to buy in, and they do require training. And once it's established, it's really effective. But yeah, it doesn't happen overnight. I would agree.
No. No, it's not. That's why, we first starting with teachers, and then when the teachers have the belief, then I'm sure it's like just a matter of time to convince the student to get benefits from it. Well, okay. Well, dear our audience, I know you want to ask more, but that's really the best I can do. Do leave us some good feedback on this particular session on the survey tab. You can see it right in the chat box right there. So let us know what you think. Maybe we try to invite Susan again very soon sometimes.
It'd be my pleasure.
Yes, lovely. Well, I must say that we had to say goodbye for now, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye, Susan.
Bye-bye.